In the quiet town of Riverstone, Virginia, a 90-year-old woman was about to teach a vicious motorcycle gang a lesson they'd never forget. Margaret Peggy Thompson seemed like any other elderly resident until the day the Shadow Vipers made the mistake of harassing her at a local gas station. What the notorious gang didn't know was that this gentle-looking grandmother was one of Vietnam's most decorated helicopter pilots, with over 200 successful rescue missions behind enemy lines. When their intimidation crossed the line, Peggy made one phone call that would change everything. The Shadow Vipers, led by the ruthless Havoc, thought they were dealing with an easy target. Instead, they found themselves face to face with over 50 combat-hardened veteran bikers, men whose lives Peggy had saved decades ago in the jungles of Vietnam. What began as a day of bullying and harassment ended in an extraordinary transformation that would reshape the future of Riverstone forever. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have special story for you. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the quiet streets of Riverstone when Peggy Thompson started her daily routine. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, her posture still remarkably straight from years of military service. She guided her weathered Ford Taurus into Mike's Gas and Go, the same station she'd been visiting for the past 30 years. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," called Jimmy, the young attendant, his smile bright and genuine. "The usual today, just a full tank, Jimmy," Peggy replied, carefully stepping out of her car. Her movements were measured but purposeful, a testament to the discipline that had carried her through decades of service. The familiar scent of gasoline and morning dew filled the air. As she began filling her tank, her mind wandered to the V8 meetings she needed to attend later that morning. These meetings were more than just gatherings. They were a connection to her past, to the men and women who understood what it meant to serve. The peaceful morning shattered with the distant rumble of motorcycles. The sound grew louder, more menacing, until the thunder of engines filled the small gas station. 5 motorcycles, then 10, then 15 rolled into the lot, their chrome gleaming under the morning sun. The Shadow Vipers had arrived. Peggy's hand remained steady on the pump as she watched them through the reflection in her car window. Her military training kicked in, automatically assessed the threat, maintain awareness, stay calm. The leader, a man they called Havoc, dismounted his bike with practiced arrogance. His leather vest bore patches that spoke of violence and intimidation, his eyes cold as they fixed upon her. "Well, what do we have here?" Havoc's voice carried across the lot, drawing snickers from his gang. "Grandma's out for her morning drive," Peggy continued, filling her tank, her expression neutral. She'd faced worse in her time. Much worse. The jungles of Vietnam had taught her that real danger rarely announced itself so boldly. "I'm just getting gas," she replied evenly. "No need for any trouble." One of the gang members, a tall man with a scraggly beard, sauntered closer. His eyes caught the glint of her license plate holder. "Hey, Havoc, check this out. Vietnam veteran, you hear that the old lady claims she's a vet?" Havoc's laughter was sharp and mocking. "A woman veteran? What did you do in sweetheart? Serve coffee to the real soldiers?" The words struck something deep inside Peggy, but her expression remained unchanged. They couldn't know about the countless nights she'd spent flying through enemy fire, the hundreds of soldiers she pulled from certain death, the medals that sat in a box in her closet. "I served my country," she said simply, replacing the gas pump. Havoc stepped closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. "Serve your country? Let me tell you something about service, old woman. The only thing you've served is dinner." The other gang members spread out, forming a loose circle around her car. Jimmy had disappeared inside the station, his face pale as he reached for the phone. Peggy knew he was probably calling the police, but she also knew they wouldn't arrive in time to matter. "You should move along," Havoc continued, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "This isn't your kind of place anymore. The Shadow Viper own Riverstone now." Peggy straightened her back, her eyes meeting Havoc's without flinching. "Young man, I've faced things that would make your little gang run crying home to mama. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." She moved to open her car door, but one of the gang members slammed it shut. The sound echoed across the lot like a gunshot. Peggy's heart rate didn't even flutter. She'd heard real gunshots, felt the heat of real explosions. "Maybe you didn't hear me clearly." Havoc leaned in close, his breath hot against her face. "This is our town now, and in our town you show respect." Peggy's voice remained steady as she replied, "Respect is earned, son. And so far, all I see are boys playing at being men." The words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment the only sound was the idle rumble of motorcycle engines. Then Havoc's face twisted into something ugly, something dangerous. His hand shot out, grabbing Peggy's arm with bruising force. "You want to learn about respect? We'll teach you all about respect." As his fingers dug into her arm, Peggy's mind flashed back to a night in '68 when she pulled a young soldier from the burning wreckage of his helicopter. That soldier had grown up to become Colonel Jack "Iron Jack" Morrison, now the leader of the largest veteran motorcycle club in the state. The same Jack Morrison who had told her, "If you ever need anything, Peggy, anything at all, you just call." She hadn't needed to make that call in all these years, but as she looked into eyes, seeing the cruelty there, she knew that was about to change. The Shadow Vipers had no idea what they just started, but they were about to learn a lesson about real strength, real courage, and real respect. And it would begin with a single phone call. Havoc's grip on Peggy's arm tightened as his gang circled closer. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gas station's cracked pavement, turning the scene into a dark tableau of intimidation. But Peggy Thompson hadn't survived Vietnam by giving in to bullies. "Take your hand off me," she said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used to command helicopter crews through enemy fire. Now something in her voice made Havoc hesitate for just a moment. His fingers loosened slightly, but his sneer remained fixed. "Or what, Grandma, you'll tell on us?" "I don't make threats," Peggy replied, carefully extracting her arm from his grip. "I never have, but I promise you, son, you're making a mistake." One of the other gang members, a younger man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, laughed harshly. "Hear that, Havoc? The old lady's making promises." Peggy used their moment of amusement to slide into her car, her movements deliberate and controlled. Through the windshield, she could see Jimmy inside the station, still on the phone, his face tight with worry. She knew the local police wouldn't do much. The Shadow Vipers had been terrorizing Riverstone for months now, and law enforcement seemed powerless to stop them. "You're not going anywhere," Havoc declared, placing his hand on her car hood. "Not until we teach you about respect." "Respect?" Peggy started her engine, the familiar rumble of her old Taurus bringing comfort. "Let me tell you something about respect. I earned mine pulling men twice your size out of burning helicopters while bullets flew past my head. What have you done besides terrorized innocent people?" Her words struck a nerve. Havoc's face darkened, and he signaled to his gang. Within moments, they had surrounded her car with their motorcycles, blocking her exit from every angle. "Get out of the car," Havoc demanded. Now, instead of complying, Peggy reached for her phone. The action made several gang members tense up, expecting a call to the police. But Peggy wasn't calling the authorities, not yet. "You want to see what real respect looks like?" she asked, her fingers hovering over the keypad. "Just wait," Havoc laughed, the sound echoing off the gas station's metal roof. "Oh, I get it. You're calling for help. Maybe your grandkids. The police. Go ahead, call whoever you want. We'll still be here." Peggy's mind flashed back to a particularly harrowing night in Vietnam. The rain had been coming down in sheets, visibility near zero, but she'd heard the distress call. A squad was pinned down, taking heavy fire. Among them was a young lieutenant named Jack Morrison. She'd flown in blind, using nothing but instinct and skill, and pulled them all out alive. "You boys ever hear of the Veterans Guard?" she asked, her finger pressing the first number. Several of the gang members shifted uncomfortably. The Veterans Guard was well known in biker circles, a motorcycle club composed entirely of combat veterans, led by the legendary Iron Jack Morrison. They weren't just any biker group. They were organized, disciplined, and commanded respect, even from the most hardened outlaws. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What's that got to do with anything?" Snake Tattoo asked, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "Now everything," Peggy replied, simply continuing to dial. "You see, back in '68 there was this young lieutenant. His chopper went down deep in enemy territory. Everyone said it was a suicide mission to go in after him, but Ty went anyway." The phone began to ring. Havoc's expression flickered between anger and confusion. "That Lieutenant," Peggy continued, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet lot. "His name was Jack Morrison. These days people call him Iron Jack, and he owes me a favor." The phone connected. A gruff voice answered. "Morrison, Jack. It's Peggy Thompson. Remember that night near Quezon?" There was a pause, then Iron Jack's voice softened with recognition. Peggy, of course. I remember. I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for you. What's wrong? Peggy's eyes locked with Havoc's. As she spoke, I got some young men here who need a lesson in respect. The Shadow Vipers. They seem to think Riverstone belongs to them. Now the change in Iron Jack's voice was immediate, turning to steel. Where are you? Mike's gas. And go take your time coming over. These boys aren't going anywhere. As she ended the call, the atmosphere in the lot had shifted. Several of the gang members were looking at each other nervously. The Shadow Vipers might rule Riverstone through fear, but the Veterans Guard was something else entirely. Havoc tried to maintain his composure, but Peggy could see the uncertainty in his eyes. You're bluffing. Iron Jack wouldn't come running just because some old woman called. You sure about that? Peggy asked, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Want to stick around and find out? In the distance, the distinct rumble of approaching motorcycles began to fill the air. It wasn't the chaotic roar of the Shadow Viper bikes. This was different. This was the synchronized rumble of a disciplined unit moving as one. Havoc's face paled slightly as the sound grew louder. Mount up, he barked to his gang, trying to maintain control of the situation. We're not done here, old woman. Not by a long shot. The Shadow Vipers scrambled onto their bikes, engines roaring to life. As they peeled out of the lot, Havoc pointed at Peggy, his fingers shaking slightly. This isn't over. You've just made things worse for yourself. Peggy watched them go, her expression calm. She knew they'd be back. Bullies always came back. But now the rules had changed. As the sound of the Veteran Guard grew closer, she allowed herself a small smile. The Shadow Vipers were about to learn what real strength looked like, and the lesson was just beginning. The morning sun had risen and higher now, burning away the last traces of dawn in its light. Peggy could see the first bikes of the Veterans Guard appearing on the horizon, their chrome gleaming like armor. The real story was about to begin. The Veterans Guard arrived like thunder, their bikes moving in perfect formation. As they poured into the gas station lot, 50 riders strong, each one a combat veteran, their leather vests adorned with military patches and unit insignias. At their head rose Colonel Jack Iron Jack Morrison, his silver hair catching the morning light, his presence commanding respect. Without a word being spoken, Jimmy, the gas station attendant, watched wide-eyed from behind the glass as the veterans filled his lot. These weren't the chaotic, undisciplined riders he was used to seeing. These men moved with military precision, their bikes arranging themselves in a defensive perimeter around Peggy's Taurus. Iron Jack dismounted first, removing his helmet to reveal a weather face marked by time and experience, his eyes sharp as ever. Immediately found Peggy. A smile broke through his stern expression as he approached her. Been a long time, Captain Thompson, he said, his voice carrying the weight of shared history. Too long, Jack. Peggy replied, straightening instinctively. Old habits died hard, though I wish the reunion was under better circumstances. Iron Jack's expression hardened as he glanced in the direction, and the Shadow Vipers had fled. Tell me everything. As Peggy recounted the morning's events, more veterans gathered around, their faces growing darker with each detail. These men understood respect. They'd earned it the hard way in jungles and deserts, watching their brothers fall and rise together. The Shadow Vipers, one of the veterans spat, they'd been causing trouble up and down the coast times. Someone taught them a lesson. Iron Jack raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. Peggy here taught me something important back in '68. You remember what you told me that night, Captain, when everyone else said the mission was impossible? Peggy smiled slightly. I told you that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. That's right, Jack nodded. And you showed us what that meant when you flew into that hot zone. Lost count of how many rounds hit your chopper that night. One of the younger veterans stepped forward, his eyes wide with recognition. Wait, this is the Angel of Kesson, the pilot who saved the entire 5th platoon. The one and only, Jack confirmed, though she never did like that nickname. Peggy waved away the title. There were dozens of pilots braver than me. I just did what needed doing, just did what needed doing, Jack echoed with a laugh. She says that like it was nothing. Boys, this woman flew into the teeth of enemy fire more times than anyone could count, saved my life and the lives of countless others. And now some punk gang thinks they can intimidate her. The veteran faces hardened with resolve. These men understood debt, understood loyalty. Each of them had served, had known the terror of combat, and the brotherhood had forged. The Shadow Vipers will be back, Peggy said, her voice steady. "They're not the type to let this go, let them come," Jack replied, his tone grim. "But first we need to understand what we're dealing with. Tell me about their leader, this Havoc." As Peggy described the gang's leader, Iron, Jack's expression grew increasingly concerned. He recognized the type of bully who'd never faced real resistance, who confused fear with respect. They'd been terrorizing Riverstone for months. Jimmy added from nearby, finally brave enough to join the conversation. "Police can't or won't do anything about it." Iron Jack nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "Peggy, you've got a VA meeting to attend, don't you?" "Yes, but under the circumstances you'll attend." Jack cut her off with a smile. "Just like any other day. But you won't be going alone." He turned to his men, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had led them through combat. "Alpha Team, you're on escort duty. Beta and Charlie, start patrols. I want eyes on every corner of Riverstone. The Shadow Vipers want to play games. Let's show them how veterans handle business." The veterans moved with practiced efficiency, breaking into their assigned groups. Iron Jack turned back to Peggy, his expression softening. "We'll handle this, Captain, the old way." Peggy looked at the assembly, veterans, men who understood sacrifice and honor in ways the Shadow Vipers never could. "Just try not to destroy the town in the process." "Jack, Riverstone's been my home for 40 years. No promises." Jack grinned, but his eyes were serious. "But these boys need to learn that respect isn't taken, it's earned. And they're about to get one hell of a lesson." As the veterans mounted their bikes, preparing to escort Peggy to her meeting, she couldn't help but remember another time, another place, when these same men had been young soldiers fighting for their lives. Now they were here, ready to fight again, not for country this time, but for something just as important: the right to live without fear. The morning had started with intimidation from the Shadow Vipers. Now, as the veterans' guards' engines roared to life, it was about to become something else entirely. The war for Riverstone's soul was about to begin, and Peggy Thompson, despite her 90 years, found herself once again at the center of the storm. Iron Jack's voice carried over the rumble of engines. "Just like old times." He captained. Peggy smiled as she got into her car, the veterans forming up around her. "Just like old times, Lieutenant, just like old times." The convoy pulled out of the gas station, a display of power and discipline that couldn't have been more different from the Shadow Viper's chaotic presence in its wake. Jimmy stood watching, a smile spreading across his face. Something was changing in Riverstone, and for the first time in months it felt like change for the better. Across town, in an abandoned warehouse that served as the Shadow Vipers' clubhouse, Havoc paced the oil-stained floor. His boots echoed against the concrete as his gang watched nervously. The morning's encounter had shaken their usual confidence, though none would admit it openly. The veteran guard Havoc's back, kicking an empty beer can across the floor. "That old woman knows." Iron Jack Morrison, "Of all the people in this worthless town, we had to pick her." Snake Tattoo leaned against his bike, trying to maintain his tough exterior. "So what? They're just another MC. We've dealt with rival clubs before." One of the older members, a man called Diesel, shook his head. "No, these guys are different. They're not just bikers, they're combat vets." Organ, his eyes disciplined. "They've seen real war. We've seen plenty of action," Havoc growled, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "Not like them," Diesel insisted. "I heard stories about Iron Jack. He runs the veterans' guard like a military unit. And that woman, if she really is the pilot they call the Angel of Cuisine, I don't care if she's the Queen of England." Havoc exploded, his fist slamming into a nearby locker. "This is our town now. We can't let some old woman and her veteran friends push us around. We'll lose everything we've built here." Meanwhile, Peggy's convoy arrived at the VA center, the veterans' guards' bikes forming a protective perimeter around the parking lot. As she stepped out of her car, several veterans who'd been waiting for the meeting came out to greet her, their eyes wide at the impressive escort. "Quite an entrance." Peggy smiled. "Sarah Chen, a Gulf War veteran who ran the VA support group, though I hear you've had quite a morning." "Word travels fast," Peggy observed, straightening her cardigan. "Hard to miss 50 veterans' guard bikes rolling through town." Sarah replied. "Want to tell us what happened inside the VA center?" As the meeting began, Peggy shared the morning's events. The room was packed with veterans of various ages, from Vietnam era to recent conflicts. Their reactions ranged from anger to grim determination as they heard how the Shadow Vipers had treated one of their own. I remembered something this morning, Peggy said, her voice carrying across the quiet room something from my last mission in Vietnam. We were pulling out a group of Marines under heavy fire. The helicopter was taking hits, hydraulics were failing, but we couldn't leave those boys behind. The room was silent, everyone leaning in to listen, even the veterans. Guard members stationed outside had come in to hear her story. One of the young Marines asked me later why I came back for them, when everyone else said it was too risky. I told him something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the biggest act of courage is standing up for others when everyone else looks away. Iron Jack, standing at the back of the room, nodded slowly. That's what we're doing now, Peggy, standing up for Riverstone. But before anyone could respond, the distant roar of motorcycles filled the air through the windows. They could see clouds of dust rising from the road leading to the VA center. The Shadow Vipers were returning, and this time they'd brought reinforcements. Looks like Havoc called in some friends, Iron Jack observed, grimly counting the approaching bikes. At least 30 more riders. Peggy stood, her movement drawing every eye in the room. Jack, I won't have violence at the VA center. These people come here for healing, not fighting, agreed Iron Jack replied, already moving toward the door. Delta team, escort our veterans out the back entrance. Everyone else mount up. We're taking this somewhere else. The veterans guard moved with tactical precision, helping the VA meeting attendees to safety while preparing for confrontation. Peggy watched as Sarah Chen efficiently organized the evacuation, proving that military training never really faded. Outside, the Shadow Vipers and their reinforcements lined up across the street from the VA center, their bikes forming an intimidating wall of chrome and steel. Havoc sat at the center, his face twisted with anger and wounded pride. Come on out, old woman, he shouted, his voice carrying across the parking lot. You and your veteran friends can't hide in there forever. Iron Jack stepped out first, his presence commanding attention. Behind him, the veteran guard took positions, their formation precise and threatening. Peggy emerged last, her head held high, showing no fear. Son, she called out to Havoc, her voice clear and steady. You're making a mistake. This isn't about pride or territory. This is about right and wrong. Stand down before someone gets hurt. Havoc's response was cut off by the sudden arrival of police sirens. 3 patrol cars screamed into the parking lot, lights flashing. Chief Roberts, a Vietnam AA Marine, himself stepped out of the lead car. Nobody's fighting at my VA center, he announced, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. Havoc, you and your boys need to leave now. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Havoc looked from the police to the veterans guard, then to Peggy, his face a mask of fury and frustration. Finally, he kicked his bike to life. This isn't over, he snarled, not by a long shot, as the Shadow Vipers reluctantly withdrew their reinforcements. Following, Iron Jack turned to Peggy. He's right about one thing, this isn't over. Peggy watched the dust clouds fade on the horizon, her expression thoughtful. No, it's not, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air. Chief Roberts approached them, holstering his weapon. Peggy, Jack, we need to talk. The Shadow Vipers have been a problem for months, but now they're desperate, and desperate men do desperate things. The morning sun had reached its peak, casting harsh shadows across the VA center parking lot. As Peggy looked at the assembled faces, police, veterans, friends, she knew that Riverstone was about to change. The only question was, would it be for better or worse? The war for the soul of their town was just beginning, and she was once again in the pilot's seat. Just like in Vietnam, lives hung in the balance. But this time, the enemy wasn't hiding in the jungle. They were right here in plain sight, and they weren't going anywhere. Chief Roberts, LED, Peggy, Iron Jack, and several senior veterans guard members into the VA center's conference room. The blinds were drawn, casting striped shadows across the wooden table where they gathered. Outside, the remaining guard members maintained their vigilant patrol of the perimeter. Let me be direct, Roberts began, spreading a map of Riverstone across the table. The Shadow Vipers have been systematically taking over this town. They started with protection rackets on 3rd Street, then moved to intimidating business owners in the historic district. Now they've got half the town terrified to speak out. Iron Jack leaned forward, his fingers tracing the marked locations. How many are we dealing with? Core group is about 25, Roberts replied, but after today's show Havoc's called in favors, we're looking at maybe 75 riders total, spread across 3 affiliated gangs. Peggy studied the map quietly, her mind working with the same tactical precision that had kept her alive during countless missions. They're not just causing trouble randomly. There's a pattern here, she pointed to several locations. Look, they've established presence along every major route in and out of Riverstone. They're not just terrorizing the town, they're controlling it. Smart observation, Roberts nodded. But that's not the worst of it. We've got intel suggesting they're moving into drug trafficking, using Riverstone as a distribution hub. Iron Jack's face darkened. Not anymore. They're not easy, Jack, Peggy cautioned. We need to be smarter than them. Tell me, Chief, why haven't you moved against them before now? Robert's expression turned bitter. Politics. The mayor's office is worried about escalation. Plus, we've got reason to believe someone in City Hall is on their payroll. Meanwhile, across town in the Shadow Viper warehouse, Havoc was holding his own council of war. The reinforcements had brought not just numbers but experience, hardened riders who dealt with rival gangs before. The Veterans Guard is different. A rider from one of the allied gangs warned they've got military training discipline. They're not your typical MC. Havoc slammed his fist on the table. I don't care what they are. This is about respect. That old woman humiliated us in front of the whole town. We let this stand. We might as well pack up and leave. Maybe we should, Diesel suggested carefully. Find easier territory. The suggestion earned him a violent shove from Havoc. This isn't about territory anymore. This is personal. That woman, those veterans, they think they're better than us, think they can just waltz in and take what's ours back. At the VA Center, the strategy session continued. Sarah Chen had joined them, bringing coffee and her own military intelligence background. We need to understand what we're really fighting for, Peggy said, her voice drawing everyone's attention. This isn't about territory or pride. It's about the soul of Riverstone. She stood, moving to the window. I've lived here 40 years, watched children grow up, families put down roots. The Shadow Vipers aren't just threatening our safety, they're threatening our way of life. Iron Jack nodded slowly. You're right, but how do we fight them without turning Riverstone into a war zone? The same way I fought in Vietnam, Peggy replied, turning back to face them with precision intelligence. And by choosing our battles carefully. She returned to the map, pointing to specific locations. They've made themselves look strong by spreading fear, but spread too thin. Even the strongest force becomes vulnerable. Chief Roberts leaned forward, intrigued. What are you suggesting we start with the businesses they're extorting? Peggy explained. The Veterans Guard provides protection, shows the town they're not alone. Meanwhile, we gather evidence of their drug operation, real evidence that even City Hall can't ignore. They won't take that lying down, Sarah warned. No, Peggy agreed, they won't, which is exactly what we're counting on. When people get angry, they get sloppy, make mistakes. Iron Jack smiled grimly. Just like that night in Cannes. Draw them in, make them commit their forces, then hit them where they're weakest. Exactly, Peggy nodded. But this time we're not fighting with bullets, we're fighting for hearts and minds. Show Riverstone that there's still good people willing to stand up to bullies. Robt scratched his chin thoughtfully. It could work, but it's risky. The Shadow Vipers will retaliate, of course. They will, Peggy said calmly, but this time we'll be ready. And this time they'll learn what real strength looks like. Outside, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across Riverstone. In houses and shops across town, people watched and waited, wondering what would come next. The arrival of the Veterans Guard had given them something they hadn't felt in months, hope. Iron Jack stood, his decision made. All right, Peggy, we'll do this your way, but I want you protected at all times. Havoc's the type to take this personally. Peggy smiled slightly. Jack, I've been shot by better men than Havoc, but I appreciate the concern. As the meeting concluded and plans were set in motion, Sarah pulled Peggy aside. You know what you're starting here, don't you? This could change everything. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Peggy replied, her eyes steady with determination. Sometimes things need to change. Sometimes they need to be forced to change. The war for Riverstone was about to enter a new phase, not with violence and chaos, but with strategy and purpose. Just as she had in Vietnam, Peggy Thompson was about to teach another lesson about courage, respect, and the true meaning of strength. And this time the whole town would be watching. Dawn broke over Riverstone's historic district, painting the old brick buildings in shades of gold. The street was quiet, except for the steady rumble of motorcycles, not the chaotic roar of the Shadow Vipers, but the disciplined hum of Veterans Guard bikes positioned at strategic points along 3rd Street. Inside Mason's Hardware, The oldest store in Riverstone, Tom Mason, was having his first peaceful morning in months. His hand shook slightly as he counted out his register drawer, not from fear this time, but from relief. They usually show up by now, he told the two veterans guard members stationed inside his store, every morning like clockwork, demanding their protection money. One of the veterans, a former Army Ranger named Mike, nodded grimly. Not today, it won't. Peggy sat in her usual booth at Diana's diner across the street, sipping coffee and watching the scene unfold. Iron Jack sat across from her, his own coffee untouched. They'll test us, he said quietly. Probably today. I'm counting on it, Peggy replied, her eyes scanning the street. Havoc's not the type to back down easily. His pride won't let him. As if on key, the distant sound of approaching motorcycles filled the air. The Shadow Vipers appeared at the end of 3rd Street, their bikes gleaming in the morning light. Havoc led the pack, but he pulled up short when he saw the veterans' guard positions right on schedule. Peggy murmured, setting down her coffee cup. The Shadow Vipers idled their bikes, clearly unsure how to proceed. The veterans' guard members didn't move, didn't react. They simply watched their presence. A clear message. Havoc revved his engine angrily and dismounted, storming toward Mason's hardware. 2 veterans guard members stepped out to meet him, their posture relaxed but ready. This is private property, Mike said calmly. Mr. Mason isn't interested in your kind of protection anymore. Is that right? Havoc snarled, his face ringing. Why don't we ask Tom himself? Inside the diner, Iron Jack started to rise, but Peggy placed a hand on his arm. Wait, she said softly. Watch what happens. Tom Mason emerged from his store, standing straight for the first time in months. Behind him, more veterans appeared, a solid wall of support. You heard them, Havoc tonk voice carried across the suddenly quiet street. We don't need your protection. We've got real veterans watching over us now. Havoc's hand twitched toward his jacket, but he froze when he saw how many veterans guard members had materialized around him. They hadn't drawn weapons, hadn't made threats. They simply stood there, their presence an unmistakable warning. This isn't over, old man. And Havoc spat at Tom. None of this is over. He turned his eyes, finding Peggy through the diner window, their gazes locked, and Peggy saw something dangerous flash across his face. Wounded pride mixed with murderous rage. You did this, he shouted, pointing at her. You think you can just walk in and turn everyone against us? We built something here. Peggy stood slowly, walking to the diner's door. Every eye on the street followed her movement as she stepped outside. What exactly did you build, son? Her voice was steady, carrying to every ear fear. Intimidation. That's not building, that's destroying. Other business owners had emerged from their shops, now watching the confrontation. The Shadow Vipers shifted uneasily on their bikes, outnumbered and outmatched by the veterans guards' disciplined presence. You don't understand anything. Havoc's voice shook with rage. This town was dead before we came. We made it strong. No, Peggy replied, taking another step forward. You made it afraid. There's a difference. She gestured to the veterans around them. These men and women, they know what real strength is. They fought real battles, not just bullied innocent people. They understand something you never have. Respect isn't taken by force. It's earned through actions. Havoc's face contorted with fury. He took a step toward Peggy, but instantly found his path blocked by Iron Jack and 3 other veterans. Think carefully about your next move, son. Iron Jack's voice was soft, but carried an edge of steel. Very carefully. For a long moment, tension crackled through the air. Then Havoc backed away, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. This is our town, he snarled, mounting bike. You want a war? You've got one. The Shadow Vipers roared away, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and threats. As their noise faded, the street remained silent for a moment. Then, surprisingly, someone started to clap. Others joined in the sound building as business owners and residents emerged fully from their shops. Tom Mason approached Peggy, tears in his eyes. Thank you, he said simply. We've been waiting for someone to stand up to them. We were afraid. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Peggy assured him. But this isn't over. Havoc will be back, and he'll be looking for revenge. Iron Jack joined them, his expression serious. We've won the first battle, but you're right. This is just the beginning. He'll hit back hard. Try to make an example. Let him try, Peggy replied, watching the gathering crowd of townspeople. Every move he makes now just shows Riverstone who he really is and who we really are. Sarah Chan arrived, slightly out of breath. Just got word the Shadow Vipers are gathering at their warehouse, calling in more reinforcements. Peggy nodded, unsurprised. Good. Let them come. The more forces they commit, the more vulnerable they become. She turned to address the gathered veteran and townspeople. Today, we showed them that Riverstone isn't afraid anymore, but tomorrow, they'll try to remind us why we should be. We need to be ready. The sun had risen fully, now washing the street in bright light. The shadow of fear that had hung over Riverstone was lifting, but everyone knew the real storm was still coming. Havoc and his gang wouldn't go quietly, wouldn't accept defeat easily. But looking at the faces around her, veterans, standing tall, townspeople finding their courage, Peggy knew they had already won something important. They had given Riverstone back its dignity, its spirit. Now, they just had to keep it. Night fell over Riverstone like a velvet curtain, bringing with it an uneasy quiet. The veterans' guard maintained their patrols, their bikes moving silently through the darkened streets. In the 2 days since the confrontation on 3rd Street, tension had built like a thunderhead before a storm. Peggy sat in her living room, reviewing reports from different veterans' guard units. Sarah Chen had set up a makeshift command center in her kitchen, complete with radio communications and a detailed map of Riverstone, marked with Shadow Vipers' known locations. Movement at the warehouse. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. Large group heading out, at least 30 bikes. Iron Jack's response came quickly. All units maintain positions. Let's see what they're planning. Peggy moved to her window, drawing the curtain back slightly. 2 veterans were parked across the street, their bikes dark and silent. She knew there were more nearby, hidden in strategic positions throughout her neighborhood. The quiet shattered with the sound of breaking glass. Fire at Mason's Hardware. A voice shouted over the radio, multiple perpetrators moving fast. Before anyone could respond, another report cut in. Molotov cocktail at Diana's Diner. They're hitting multiple targets. Iron Jack's voice remained steady. All units converge on downtown. Protection teams stay with assigned locations. This is what we trained for. Peggy was already moving, grabbing her car keys. Sarah stepped in her path, shaking her head. You're their primary target, Peggy. You need to stay secure. Those are my friends out there, Peggy replied, her voice firm. I start this, I won't hide while they suffer for it. The radio crackled again. They're targeting veteran-owned businesses. Pete's auto shop is burning. Sarah and Peggy shared a look. This wasn't random violence. The Shadow Vipers were sending a message. Outside, the night sky had taken on an orange glow as multiple fires burned across Riverstone. The sound of sirens mixed with motorcycle engines as both police and veterans guard responded to the attacks. Let me through, Peggy demanded. And this time Sarah didn't argue. They rushed to Peggy's car, accompanied by their security detail. Downtown Riverstone had become a battlefield. The Shadow Vipers had struck fast and coordinated, hitting businesses that had dared to stand up to them. Fire trucks were already on scene at Mason's Hardware, where Tom Mason stood watching his family's legacy burn. They knew exactly when to hit. Iron Jack said as Peggy approached. Had to have inside information about patrol patterns. Your mole in City Hall. Peggy nodded grimly. They're trying to show the town what happens when people resist. Nearby, Diana's Diner had suffered less damage thanks to quick action by veterans. Guard members who'd been inside. Diana herself, a tough woman in her 60s, was helping direct firefighters while cursing colorfully about the Shadow Vipers. Chief Roberts is coordinating with state police. Sarah reported, checking her phone, but Havoc's gang is staying just ahead of them. Hitting and running. A motorcycle roared past its rider, laughing as he threw another Molotov cocktail. Before it could hit its target, a veteran's guard rider intercepted, knocking the explosive device away. It shattered harmlessly in the street. This is just the beginning, Iron Jack warned, watching the flames reflect off nearby windows. Havoc showing us what he's willing to do next time will be worse. As if to confirm his words, a new voice cut through their radios. They're at the VA Center. Multiple hostiles armed. Peggy's blood ran cold. The VA Center wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary for veterans dealing with the scars of war, both visible and invisible. That's crossing a line, Iron Jack growled, already moving toward his bike. Wait, Peggy called out. That's what they want, to draw our forces thin, make us react emotionally. She turned to address the gathered veterans and townspeople. This isn't about property damage. Havoc's trying to break our spirit, make us feel helpless again. Tom Mason stepped forward, his face streaked with soot. "What do we do then? Just let them burn our town down?" "No," Peggy replied, her voice carrying the same authority that had commanded respect in combat zones. "We show them that fire hardens steel. It doesn't destroy it." She looked at the gathering crowd, veterans, business owners, residents who'd lived in fear for too long. In their faces, she saw not defeat but determination. "Havoc thinks he can break us by breaking our things," she continued. "But Riverstone isn't about buildings, it's about people, and people, when they stand together, are stronger than any gang." As if to punctuate her words, more townspeople began arriving, bringing water supplies and offers of help. The Shadow Vipers had meant to demonstrate their power, but they'd inadvertently revealed something else, the true strength of community. Peggy turned to her friend. "Contact every business owner in town. Tell them we're calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. It's time." Riverstone showed Havoc what real strength looks like. Iron Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You're thinking about Operation Rolling Thunder." "Something like that." Peggy smiled grimly. "But this time we're not just fighting for territory, we're fighting for home." The fires continued to burn, but they illuminated more than destruction. They showed neighbors helping neighbors, veterans standing guard, and a town finally ready to fight back. The Shadow Vipers had wanted to break Riverstone's spirit. Instead, they'd forget stronger. As dawn approached, Peggy stood in front of the damaged VA center, watching volunteers already beginning repairs. The night's attacks had been meant to demoralize them, but looking at the determined faces around her, she knew Havoc had made a critical mistake. He'd shown his hand too early, played his cards too aggressively.